Ho'ea, dona wichoch angile oyapchapi hechi hena iuha chantewashtea na bechiuzapalo. Hello, my name is Peter Hill, and together with my colleague Sierra Concha, I will be presenting the paper Living Legends, Adapting Centuries-Old Lakota Stories for Use in Contemporary Educational Settings. I want to first start out by situating myself. I am a non-Lakota person, what in Canada they refer to as a settler, and here in the States, just a white guy. But I've been living and working on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota for the past 20 years. I started learning the Lakota language from my first day out here, right out of college, and had been involved with the Lakota revitalization movement for at least the past dozen years. I currently work for a Lakota immersion school that I co-founded in 2012.
Hamitakiapi, Alyssa Sierra Concha Emachiapi, Wazi Ahaha Emataha na Lelwati. Hello, my name is Alyssa Sierra Concha, and many call me Sierra, and I am from the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. I am 25 years old, and I am the Lakota language immersion teacher for first grade. I also teach nightly adult Lakota language classes. I am Lakota, Ojibwe, and Taos Pueblo. Learning and teaching the Lakota language is so important to me, and I plan to be a part of the language revitalization movement for the rest of my life.
Sierra and my presentation today will center around the collected works of Ella Deloria, who was one of the first Indigenous linguists and anthropologists to do field work among her own people. We will discuss how the immersion program where we work has taken stories that Deloria collected nearly 100 years ago and adapted them for the children in the immersion school, as well as adult learners. We will also talk about some of the considerations our team members have had to weigh in determining how best to tailor Deloria's work for the optimal learning of our students. In particular, how to balance change and adaptation with the need to maintain authenticity and integrity of the original material. As you assumedly know, Indigenous languages are inextricably bound to the cultures that gave rise to them. And so Indigenous language learners should have access to language resources that are also infused with cultural knowledge. In Lakota country, we language educators have a tremendous resource in the collected stories of Ella Deloria. Deloria towers over the Lakota and Dakota language reclamation movement. I often refer to her as the giant on whose shoulders all of us who work in Lakota Dakota language reclamation stand. Deloria, whose Lakota name was Ampetu Ashtewi, or Good Day Woman, was born in 1889 and was fluent in both Lakota and Dakota, two languages of extremely close relationship. In her remarkable lifetime, she became an ethnographer, linguist, anthropologist, educator, and novelist. Columbia University, from which she graduated with a BA in education in 1914, refers to her as one of the first truly bilingual, bicultural figures in American anthropology, and an extraordinary scholar, teacher, and spirit who pursued her own work and commitments under notoriously adverse conditions. In 1932, Deloria's seminal Dakota Texts was published. This was a compendium of 64 Lakota stories that Deloria collected from elders on various Lakota reservations, including here on Pine Ridge, from 1927 through 1931, while working with famed anthropologist Franz Boas, to whom she dedicated the book. About 2/3 of the stories are what we might call legends. In Deloria's own words, they are, quote, a sort of holdover, so to speak, from a very, very remote past, from a different age, even from an order of beings different from ourselves. These tales, in which generally some mythological character like Iktomi the trickster, Ea the devourer, the crazy bull, the witch, or Wazia, the personification of the winter cold, takes part together with human beings and are part of the common literary story of the people. Constant allusion is made to them. Similes are drawn from them, which every intelligent adult is sure to understand, end quote. The majority of the remaining stories, in Deloria's words, quote, are accepted as having happened to our people in comparatively recent times, perhaps in the lifetime of the aged narrator's grandfather or great-grandfather. While the miraculous still runs through many of them, they are regarded as occurrences that may happen to someone aided by supernatural powers, end quote. Dakota Text is an indispensable resource for anyone working in Lakota language reclamation. especially since Deloria's interlocutors were mainly born in the mid-1800s, and so have a fluency level and a recollection of stories that go back well before the reservation era, a nearly unbroken link to pre-contact Lakota culture. And yet, for that same reason, these stories can be impenetrable for many non-speakers, even with the free translation she included. The language is so complex and often so archaic that many Lakota teachers and learners shy away from making use of them in the modern day. For this reason, it is important to consider how the stories can be adaptable so that they can continue to live on.
We work with a Lakota immersion program whose main focus is elementary education. Our students are currently in kindergarten through grade 4, and the majority spend their formative years in a Lakota immersion daycare program that was founded in 2012. This program is multifaceted and has gone through various iterations over the years, and the elementary component is currently a division of Mahpia Luta Owaiowa, or Red Cloud Indian School in Pine Ridge, South Dakota. In discussing how we have tailored Dakota texts for use in our programming, we are focusing on the elementary immersion program and also our adult second language learner program for community members. Our first step in adapting Dakota text was to retranscribe and digitize the entire compendium of stories. This served not only to make them editable and freely shareable, but also to have them rewritten in standard Lakota orthography, or SLO, which is the prevailing writing system used to represent the language in the modern day. In addition to these straight retranscriptions, we are in the process of creating 2 additional versions of the stories. Both involve simplifying and modernizing the stories for different audiences of learners, and here we will discuss the thought process and intentions behind these adaptations. The stories in Dakota text are rich and multi-layered and magnificent, but often inaccessible to Lakota learners unless their proficiency is extremely advanced. For this reason, we have created versions of the 64 stories which diverge from Deloria's original transcriptions in a handful of ways. Our edits fall into the following categories. Stories broken up from monolithic blocks of text into paragraphs and chapters. Long and complex sentences broken down into multiple shorter sentences. Obsolete grammatical forms updated to how contemporary speakers would say them. And lastly, addition of parenthetical explanatory notes in some stories. To illustrate how this works in practice, we provide the following example for reference and comparison. This story is Iktomi Kunkuki Zuya Glo Aye. Iktomi takes his mother-in-law on the warpath. The protagonist of the story, Iktomi, is the trickster in Lakota legends, which always acts in opposition to societal protocols, thus showing the proper way of behaving through his improper example. In this tale, Iktomi convinces his wife that he must take his mother-in-law to war with him. He pretends that this is a tribal mandate, even though such a decree would be unthinkable, and pretends extreme reluctance at doing so. Iktomi's wife has multiple mothers, her biological mother and her mother's sisters, who are co-wives to Iktomi's father-in-law. Iktomi scorns the idea of going with any of the older mothers-in-law, but finally eagerly assents to going with the youngest and prettiest of his wife's mothers. At the end of the story, Iktomi and his mother-in-law return to the village with a slew of children that he has fathered with her. And he is run out of the community for breaking one of the greatest kinship taboos, that of opposite sex in-law avoidance. Among traditional people, to this day, one does not even so much as look at or address the opposite sex parents-in-law.
We don't have time to cover these 2 word for word, but what you're seeing here in the first body of text is the SLO retranscription of Deloria's original, and the second is our simplified/modernized version. The structural and content differences should be obvious at first glance. Here are some examples of the changes that we made in order of the 4 points mentioned in the last slide. 1, revisions to story structure. Deloria transcribed all of the stories she had collected, which in most cases she was the first to ever write down, in monolithic blocks of text. She used a numbering system to break up the run-on nature of this method, which sometimes corresponds to single sentences and sometimes to multiples, but generally less than a paragraph's worth of text in each case. In our edited version, we broke up the stories up into paragraphs for ease of reading, and additionally put the stories into mini chapters. The heading Ogashbewanshi at the top means chapter 1. This particular story was fairly short and divided into 3 parts. Other longer stories from Dakota texts might be broken up into 8 or more chapters. We also made some other discrete structural edits across the board, replacing em dashes with quotation marks whenever a character speaks, for example. Number 2, revisions to sentence breakdown. Deloria and her interlocutors loved nothing more than a long, grammatically complex, clause-rich run-on sentence. Many of her sentences are gloriously layered and sophisticated, but these can be intimidating to Lakota learners, to say the least. For this reason, we generally divided them up into shorter, more digestible sentences. One can see in this example where Deloria's sentence 5 becomes the first 4 sentences of the 3rd paragraph in our version. Despite the change in structure, however, very little changes content-wise. Number 3, revisions to obsolete grammatical forms. These are somewhat trickier to illustrate for an audience that is not fluent in Lakota, but some examples can be drawn for contrast. In Deloria's sentence 2, the word tchagoshaha becomes lila tchashoshe in our version. A couple of changes clearly happened here, but we will focus on the change of the root verb tchagosha to tchashosha, both meaning to spit or expectorate. This is because the original tchagosha, from tchaga meaning to spit and shosha meaning muddy or turbid, evolved over the past century to become tchashosha, probably due to euphony with the 2 sha sounds. Therefore, we chose to represent the word as it would be used by a fluent speaker in telling the story in the present day. Another example from Deloria's sentence 6 is da kushe nachbach, which is quite radically different in our version, becoming wank ea ata heopusana cheche. The first sentences can be glossed as follows: dakush, an archaic form expressing somewhat condescending sympathy for the person being discussed, somewhat in line with the American Southernism, bless their heart. He, meaning that one, nachbachbaka, an archaic word meaning slovenly or unkempt, and ch'u, an archaic enclitic emphasizing an assertion. The sentence overall can be translated as, poor thing, she is of course quite slovenly. Deloria herself in her free translation does not translate it as a quotation, instead writing, but he refused to consider her because she was untidy. In our version, the sentence would be glossed as follows: wank ea, an exclamation indicating strong disagreement or disapproval, essentially as if. Ata, an intensifier. Heobuza, meaning lousy or infested with lice, and nachecha, meaning probably or very likely. The translation therefore would be, I don't think so, she is probably all lousy. Now, why did we make the changes we did? In the story, this sentence provides one of many comedy beats. In fact, the tale, while illustrating some very important cultural teachings regarding Lakota kinship roles and taboos, generally falls into the category of broad comedy. It is a funny story and meant to be told with a great deal of humor, underlying its serious message as a cautionary tale. But in practice, in the modern day, some of that meaning and richness can be obscured by archaic language, especially for the non-advanced learner. For this reason, we have chosen to use language more in line with what a fluent speaker would likely say nowadays. Also, not only is nachbachbaka archaic, it isn't even the word that Deloria's interlocutor used. In a footnote, she explains that the storyteller used a vulgarism that she didn't consider appropriate for inclusion in her 1932 book. For someone to be heopuza, on the other hand, is a familiar scenario, as lice are still an all too familiar reality of life around here, and it is a word that even early young learners would recognize and understand its humorous connotations.
As we mentioned earlier, keeping the authenticity and integrity of the stories is a paramount consideration. The alterations that we have made do make the narratives easier to navigate for today's learners, but they don't change the fundamental content of the stories. And it is important to remember that the stories, as originally transcribed by Ella Deloria, still exist in published form. Our versions don't replace them, but they provide an alternative that will hopefully be a good stepping stone for Lakota learners. It is also worth noting that the story from which we chose the above excerpts is number 2 of Deloria's 64 texts. Particularly in the earlier stories, we used a fairly heavy hand in making changes and simplifications, with a mind to ease the learners into these stories that were going to be challenging to navigate regardless. The further we got into the book, however, the less content we changed. This was because we have sequenced the stories in our curriculum according to the order that they appear in Dakota texts, and we recognized that learners would need more hand-holding early on. Thus, the complexity increases over time, even as the 4 editing criteria continue to inform our work all the way through the final story. So far, we have primarily used this material with our adult second language learners, but we have started to use them with the immersion elementary school students as well, as a central part of their reading curriculum. To this end, we have begun making even more simplified children's versions of the tales, which comprise their first exposure to these stories at a young age. This will be a central feature of their literacy curriculum at the immersion program going forward. Our long-term plan is that as the children get older, they will be reintroduced to the stories with the version of one stories that we currently use mostly with adults, then eventually the SLO version of the original Deloria stories when they get to high school or even college, depending on how far we are able to expand the immersion. The children's stories are essentially even more stripped-down versions of the originals, as you can see from this excerpt from the aforementioned Iktomi story. As you can see, the sentences in this version are more bite-sized and appropriate for young readers' first foray into Lakota stories. These are meant to be both read by the children and also read aloud to them. We are working on booklet versions of each, which will include the appendices containing key vocabulary and comprehension questions, and ultimately hope to have illustrated storybooks for each.
When completed, our work on these stories will be the first ever literacy/language arts curriculum based in traditional Lakota stories as opposed to mainstream Western children's books. These stories are rich in detail concerning Lakota culture, spirituality, kinship, societal mores, and cultural protocols. Traditionally, much of the teaching pertaining to the values of the society were not taught explicitly, but rather conveyed to children via stories such as contained in Dakota texts. Iktomi's stories showed how to be a good Lakota, paradoxically by doing the opposite of his negative example. Tales of Iya the Devourer illustrated the perils of gluttony, avarice, and immoderation. Stories of Anungite, the double-faced monster, disguising itself as a handsome man and seducing young women away from the village towards horrible fates, demonstrated the need for Lakota women to know well the man they're marrying and to abide by the courtship protocols for their own protection. Similarly, stories of deer women and elk men showed the power and danger of sexual attraction and lust. Not all of these stories are appropriate for young children, obviously, but they all contain valuable teachings, and even the least didactic are rich with detail of everyday Lakota life in the olden days, and expose the reader to vocabulary that is little used nowadays. And that is the preeminent reason for bringing these centuries-old stories into the light and putting them at the heart of our curriculum. Not because they are good vehicles for literacy, though they certainly are, but because of the abundance of cultural teachings contained within. It also must be acknowledged that anthropology and linguistics both have a very uneasy history relative to Indigenous people. In the Lakota Dakota language movement, we are therefore extremely fortunate to have had Ella Deloria in our history. As a linguist and anthropologist who was herself Lakota and Dakota, who spoke both languages and was raised with the traditional stories and cultural values of her people, she was able to approach fieldwork in a tremendously different respect from an outside researcher. The legacy that Deloria left, the stories she recorded, and her interpretations of them, Even her rich and often witty footnotes continue to guide us today and offer a template for the work we need to do going forward. Ella Deloria devoted much of her professional life to documenting her own language and cultural teachings so that they might live on for future generations. We expect that she would be gratified by the extent to which her materials are used and treasured in the present day, but we doubt she would be surprised. Someone as prescient as she had to recognize how valuable a resource she was creating for posterity. And yet it is we, those who work in Lakota language reclamation today, who must carry out her legacy. It falls on us to make sure that the stories she so diligently and lovingly collected be heard and read and told, not just left as words on a page. And at the same time, we must ensure that the curricula we create are centrally situated in culture and not just using culture as an accessory. This year, for the first time, Red Cloud immersion students are engaging with their new curriculum of stories, first recorded by Ella Deloria, great-great-grandmother to some of them. No longer is their literacy curriculum centered around stories about talking dogs or US presidents or life in New York City. They can still read about all those things, not in English, of course, but at the center will be the Lakota stories of their ancestors, their heritage. Ho hechagala, wopila kanka ungeni chiapi, wana woyunche ealu hapi hechihena ungani chiuptapi kte. Time for questions and answers.